Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. Now that speech, you may have noticed, is not from Virgil's Aeneid, which is what we are here to talk about all this year, really. We've been reading the Aeneid. We've reached a momentous transition point from the first 6 books, which are based on Homer's Odyssey, or at least loosely modeled on Homer's Odyssey, into the second 6 books about the conquering of Italy, the founding of Lavinium, and the beginnings of what will become Rome. And this part is all modeled on Homer's Iliad. And so I started with that opening monologue from Richard III, Shakespeare's Richard III, because it is also about a transition between love and war. And these are really the two great themes of poetry. Obviously, the whole world is fit subject for poetry, so you can write a poem about anything, and human life is various, and there's all sorts of things, both high and low and obscure and famous, that you can write about. But at the core of human life, especially before the modern world, it's really love and war that make up the great themes, and they correspond to the great genres of comedy and tragedy. Comedy is, nowadays we think of it as like funny stuff that we laugh at, and it is that. But really, when you think of comedy and tragedy, the classical definition is closer to the love and war. That tragedy is about conflict, often unresolvable conflict that ends in death, and comedy is about union, often the obstacles to union and the hilarity and the bumbling and the difficulty that gets in its way. But then finally, in the end of a comedy, typically you have a marriage, a wedding. And so in the Greek world, in ancient Greece, people took Homer's 2 poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, kind of as the archetypes of comedy and tragedy. Not because the Odyssey is so funny, although there are some hilarious moments in it, and there are famous episodes like the adultery between Aphrodite and Mars that are about humor and that are kind of funny. But really the point of the Odyssey is that it ends in a reunion, right? At the very end of it, as we discussed when we talked about the Odyssey, Odysseus and Penelope get back together. And so that feeling, that emotion, all that kind of the contour and the shape of that sort of story is really the prime comedy. And the Iliad, of course, ends with a death and mourning and a funeral, the death of Hector, interestingly, not of Achilles, but it is about war and fighting and death. So you can complicate this, and there's all sorts of other genres and there's all sorts of other stuff, but it's always good to have a core from which you can start. And this really is kind of the core. And Shakespeare is another playwright that really uses this, I think. You know, I just read that monologue from Richard III about the end of war and the beginning of peace, which is what Richard is talking about, that all of our weapons are being laid aside and we're going to dance instead of fighting, and war himself is going to basically try to sleep with a cute girl, and that's the whole idea. And you can see this throughout his poems, his plays and his poems, sort of this toggling back and forth between these two great modes of human existence, life and death, love and war. If you watch the fantastic Kenneth Branagh adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing, which you totally should, there is a great moment, an opening scene, which I'm pretty sure Branagh just invented. It was part of his staging of the play, that all of the men are coming home from war, and it's going to be a comedy, and so it's the end of this warlike moment, and the men are kind of strapping and they're riding back, and the girls are all coming out and they're drawing water from the well, and there's just this kind of bursting, flourishing of life. And that ancient classical idea of the transition between from sadness to happiness, from sorrow and death to joy, is just really potent. We've all felt it in one way or another in these two great forces, Aphrodite and Mars, famously in a kind of tumultuous relationship in mythology. They're also in a relationship in our lives. Conflict and love are two of the primal human driving forces now still today. So this is very effective and powerful. And as we launch into this new section, this new transition in the Aeneid, I'm going to start us out by just laying the scene and talking about the transition, the particular kind of transition that we are making between these two great themes. Because the obvious thing to say would be, well, okay, the Odyssey is over, and the Odyssey was the kind of comedic or the adventurous part of the story, and it ended at the bottom of the underworld, and then we came up, and now it's time for war. And it is time for war. In fact, there is going to be a war for Italy. That's what this whole story part of the section is going to be about. And yet, Virgil is always, because he's a highly sophisticated poet and because he's well aware of these themes and he knows what our expectations are, he is always messing with us, playing with us, challenging us to read a little bit more into the poem. And he does that here, which is one of the reasons why I think Virgil, is completely aware of what we think of as a very modern debate, which is this a happy story or a sad story? Does this story end with the grand founding of Rome, or does it end with something much darker and more chilling like the Iliad does? And that's what we're led to expect by this transition into the Iliad world, is that now it's going to get dark and gory and brutal and violent. And yet, at the same time, we need to be working our way toward a thing that we're supposed to think of as good, right? We're supposed to think like this is a happy moment, and we know from ancient commentary that it was understood the poem was meant to celebrate Augustus and Augustan Rome, etc., etc. And so there's already some complexity and some ambiguity. The Odyssey portion itself has had plenty of grief in it. There's been Dido, there's been the sorrow and the suffering of Aeneas, and like Odysseus, he's been lost at many points and had to find his way, find himself, find his mission. Now he has his mission and he's going forward into it. And the question that Virgil is going to constantly be prompting us to ask is this a comedy or a tragedy? What's happening here? What kind of story is Aeneas in? What kind of story is Rome in? And what kind of story are we living through now, that is we in Augustan Rome, as we begin this new chapter in Roman history? So even though we are now led to expect Iliad and war and tragedy, we get a couple big fake outs, a couple big moments where Virgil makes things complicated or shades in a nuanced picture of what's going on. The first one is right at the beginning, so it's good to start with the opening of Book 7 as we launch into Part 2 of the Aeneid. And right basically at the start, we finally get to the place where Virgil is going to take Aeneas to found his city and basically to reach Rome. And he sees the shore where the Tiber, the famous river of Rome, is discharging into the ocean. And it's an incredibly beautiful scene. It is the relief at long last of the end of this journey, something coming to an end and something beginning. And Virgil pulls out all the stops in terms of his powers of description. We get an ekphrasis. You may remember ekphrases from our early days when we were talking about the arrival in Carthage. And at that point, we had this very grim, foreboding description. An ekphrasis is just a long description, sometimes a work of art or a location. And that first ekphrasis that I talked about with Carthage was very grim. There was a beauty to the shore, but also something was terribly wrong, terribly off. And we were being given all these clues that there is horror and shuddering here and that we maybe shouldn't be going, like danger, Will Robinson, right? Now we're really in paradise, right? This is almost like the most idyllic. In fact, Virgil uses a word, amoinus, of the Tiber, which is the closest thing to a Latin word kind of for idyllic paradise. It's like the field where the sheep play and the agrarian life is at its most beautiful and lovely. And so this is the kind of thing we would expect from a sort of comedic or joyous moment. So here it is. I've translated it for you, as always, in Alexandrines. And this is when the sea falls still and the Tiber appears. And now the sea and sky were reddening with rays, rose gold aurora. This is Dawn, rosy-fingered Dawn from Homer, who's a major character or goddess that always kind of rising over the sea and over the horizon. The Latin version is Aurora. So rose gold Aurora in her shining chariot dispensed her light across the ether from on high. The winds relaxed, and every gust fell suddenly all still. The oars dragged slowly through the marble waves, and from the sea Aeneas spied a massive grove, through which there flowed the Tiber's wild idyllic streams. Wild idyllic streams, that's that word amoinus here, the kind of beautiful, perfect paradise. And whipping eddies bearing heaps of golden sand to burst into the ocean. All around the heights, the many birds whose voices charm the banks and streams were sailing through the upper air amid the groves. Now, you can write in and tell me that I'm wrong about this, but I do not see any of the secret foreboding that we were supposed to pick up on in Carthage. I'm not reading clues that there is danger or death or disaster here, which is interesting because, in fact, there is about to be a ton of violence. And we do, again, know to expect that. Virgil's audience would have known the outlines of the story that would have had to come, but they wouldn't have known how it was all going to play out, because that part of it is very much the job of this individual poet. So they would have been waiting to see how is he going to work these themes out. And when we get this, I mean, it really is like da 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 da, like the clouds parting, you know, a Disney movie, Bambi, all the butterflies in the air. He goes all the way up. He does everything but put, like, you know, sparkles in the sky, right? And this description of Aurora is really quite fine. I mean, it's one of, I think, Virgil's nicest moments. He takes in Homer, it's famously Eos Rhododactylos, a wonderful word meaning rosy-fingered dawn. And here it's Aurora in her shining chariot. There's gold and pink, and it's a beautiful day, and the waves fall still, and they're dragging their oars through the waves. And so we're left, I think, wondering, is this it? Like, we're only halfway through the poem, but what's there left to do? What's going to happen next? And Virgil then gives us another fake out. It's like he's turned around once to say, oh, everything's fine. Oh, but wait, now something very, very interesting happens. Something that has caused people to ask questions basically since the poem was written. For as long as we know about, people have been confused by this moment. And I like these passages that confuse people, because sometimes I think when we read classic literature, I'm actually going to get to this a little bit in the mailbag. When we read classic literature, we think that we are expected to understand everything. And if we don't, it's our fault, because all the smart people know about these poems and what they mean. And sometimes I think scholars give the wrong impression here by talking as if, yes, there is an answer to all of these questions, and the knowledgeable are able to present the absolute interpretation. Now, poems do mean something, and there are good and bad interpretations, but also ambiguity and complexity is one of the things that poetry can capture in a way that, say, prose can't always. History has to be very specific about the facts. Poetry can open up these kind of gray areas. And when you're reading a classic work of literature, if it's not something you're used to, then you should be prepared for the possibility that the questions you're asking don't have answers, that the fact you're asking them is really the point, and that the multiple different possible answers are kind of what's there. And that's so that you won't feel bad when you don't understand everything in a poem. Nobody understands everything in a great poem. That's part of the idea. And this particular moment that I'm about to talk about is one that people have failed or tried or struggled to understand, been puzzled by for centuries and centuries and generations and generations. And it is a new invocation to the muse. So you probably know, if you've been following this series or my series on epic poetry at all, that there is always at the beginning, or almost always, this is a very, very central feature of epic, that at the beginning there is an invocation to the goddesses of poetry. And those are always very important. They tell you a lot about what's happening in the poem. They introduce core themes, and the relationship between the poet and the goddess, the muse, is itself extremely important, and different poets have played with it at different times. If you go on my Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com, you can hear me read Paradise Lost, where there are multiple different invocations, and of course it's a Christian poem, so different gods and different powers are involved. Here, Virgil has already given us a very interesting and complicated invocation at the beginning of the poem, Arma virumque canno. He said, I sing about arms and a man, and then he waited for a while to introduce the muse. But he did invoke the muse, just like Homer does at the beginning of the Iliad and the beginning of the Odyssey. So in some sense, it makes good sense for him to invoke the muse, a muse, again here, because he's beginning a new poem, right? He's beginning the Iliad part of his poem. But there is a catch. And that is, he names a muse. He names a specific muse. There were multiple muses, 9 muses, daughters of the goddess of memory, and they each had a role. They each had their lane that they were in. So there were muses, there was one muse of dance, Terpsichore, and there was one muse of epic poetry, Calliope. And the muse that Virgil invokes here is not either of those, but rather Erato. And you can probably hear in her name, she is the muse of love. She is the erotic muse. And this, again, raises a bunch of incredibly thorny questions about what we are getting into. Because we thought we were in for the war part of the poem, the tragic part maybe, certainly the difficult part, the painful part. We know that we sort of are, because there's all these open questions about, well, who's already living here? Who are the indigenous peoples waiting in Latium for Aeneas to have to displace or conquer or make treaty with? And then we get this fantastic, beautiful, heavens opening description of the place itself, which looks a lot like home. And now we get an invocation to the muse, which is supposed to define the theme of the whole section. And it's a love section. It's about the muse of love, but the invocation is all about war. So big, confused Doge meme going on here. What is happening? Such complicated, very wow. I have translated this section also for you, so I'm going to read the portion of it, and then we will talk, because there's like a lot to unpack here, as they say. Okay, nunc age, now come, the king's Erato, and the times, the state of things in Latium from of old, with which the fleet collided with its armies on Ausonia's shores. I'll lay it out, recall the outbreak of the fight. Goddess, guide your bard. I speak of fearsome war. I speak of power and passion, kings and deadly blades, and all the might of Tuscany compelled to arms throughout the West. A greater order of affairs is born in me. I set a greater work in motion. That's a famous half line, maius opus moeo. And this is one of Virgil's unfinished lines. Again, whenever we come across these, he left the poem unfinished when he died, and most people assume that he intended to complete all of these lines. They all have a certain providential resonance to me. The ones that he left unfinished are interestingly kind of resonant. Maius opus movie, I set a greater work in motion. Boom. Silence, right? End of half line. And it's a big announcement. But it's basically, the announcement is equivalent to saying, now is a time for war. I need to marshal all of my greatest forces. I summon you, Jigglypuff. Like, it's so inappropriate. It's like completely out of place. Nobody quite knows. There is no right answer to why Virgil is doing this. And one very common answer, one answer that has been around for as long, basically, as the poem's been around, is that it's not that deep. He didn't really mean that much by it. Or maybe it's even sort of a mistake, or like he wasn't paying that much attention. Our old pal Servius, whom you may recall was one of the earliest commentators whose work we have on this poem, turn of the 5th century AD, is Servius the grammarian. And he says, sane, obviously, sane erato vel pro Calliope, vel pro qualicumque musa possuit. Obviously, he put Erato in place of Calliope, who is the muse of epic poetry, right? Or for whatever, for some other muse. So he's basically saying either this is some kind of bait and switch, like it's a stand-in for the muse of epic poetry, or even a mistake, like he didn't quite know which muse was the muse of epic poetry. And so, or it's just kind of like any muse will do. He just picked one off the shelf and he didn't really have a close and careful understanding of all the different roles of the muses. This has been a very common interpretation over the many centuries of debate about what's going on in this poem. Many people say, oh, you know, and it's part of kind of the Virgil disrespect that gets tossed around, that Virgil is this derivative poet, that he's kind of second string to Homer, that it's just fan fiction. And part of that is like, yeah, he's a big, like, lumbering Roman. All he cares about is patriotism and war. And he's not really concerned with these niceties of mythology. He's actually got his eye on something else, and he's not taking too much time or care to put the right muse in the right place. Or even maybe this is part of the unfinished nature of the poem. We just had an unfinished line very close to the invocation itself. Maybe this is part of the unfinishedness, and he meant to go back and like fix it. With all due respect to my man Servius and to all of the people who have come after Servius and agreed with him and said, yes, this is a mistake or this is just a generic muse, I must protest and invoke the Trump meme where he just leans into the microphone and says, wrong, this is wrong, this is dumb, this is not, I don't think, the right way to understand this passage. And always, always, you will get more out of a poem, especially a poem by a great artist like Virgil, by starting from the assumption that he knows what he's up to, that he's up to something. Doesn't mean that you are going to know exactly or give a definite answer to it. Doesn't mean he wants you to know exactly. But when he gives you a wink, when he's doing something sly, I think it's better to start with there's significance here. And when people say, you know, sometimes you'll be asked, like, aren't you reading too much into this poem? It is possible to do that. It's possible just to be like, look, the red hat stands for a red hat, right? It's not that deep. But also, especially in a poem that is clearly as carefully worked over as the Aeneid is, it pays to try first to figure out what's going on here, to interpret something and to see if there is an interpretation that fits. And in this case, I really think there clearly is, if you think of Virgil the way I think of him. If your read on Virgil is like my read on Virgil, then I think this is very much in character for him. And that is to say, I argued last time, and I've been saying, that Virgil is like always 10 steps ahead of us on ambiguity, complexity, and the capacious vision of the world that allows for good and bad in both, you know, on one hand good, and on the other hand bad. This is something that that Homer says about the muse, that she gives to the poet, good and bad, right? And I think Virgil is the consummate artist of capturing the fullness of experience, and he's way more sly and postmodern, even to use an anachronistic phrase, and tricksy than we would like assume him to be if we just write him off as this kind of dunderheaded Roman patriot, right? He's doing way fancier stuff than we could ever think to do with our interpretation. He's way ahead of us, and I think he's obviously way ahead of us here. First of all, remember what I said way back in the beginning when we were talking about Dido, about ring composition. If you will recall, I was saying that ring composition is much like the dichotomy, the contrast between love and war. Ring composition is a classic technique in poetry where you basically have a structure that takes the outside, the sort of beginning theme, and then threads another theme inside, a contrasting theme. It's like an ABBA kind of thing. Or I always talk about it like a donut with jelly inside, right? There's an outside theme, a frame theme, and then an inner theme. And you can do this for layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. You can have a theme within a theme within a theme within a theme. Hebrew poetry works this way all the time. Frame stories, obviously, which are a big device in epic, work this way. And I think the Aeneid works this way in very subtle and sophisticated ways. And when I talked last time, I was talking about war donuts with love jelly inside. And that's why I think the right way to approach this new section is to say there's a kind of ring composition going on with love and war. And in the first half of the poem, in the Odyssey section, what I said about it is that it's basically a disaster story masquerading as a love story. It's like a love donut with war jelly inside, because we are told the story of Dido and Aeneas, and that's what it's about. But within that story, we're told the destruction of Troy, the fall of Troy and the tragedy of Aeneas' life. And then, of course, the story of Dido and Aeneas itself turns into a tragedy as Aeneas has to move on. And within even the tragedy, within the love story, there are other love stories like Creusa and Aeneas, and you get to the bottom of it, and then there's another tragedy because Creusa, his first wife, dies, right? So that's how I think this whole thing works. And it's like this spiral that keeps like eating its own tail or whatever. And now I think Virgil is going to invert that. If the Dido story was a love story that really had a core of war and death, this next section is going to be a war story that really has a core, a reality of love and actually goodness and triumph. Because at the center of this war for Latium, for the territory that will become Rome, at the center of that is a girl, is Lavinia. And we're going to get in a second to who Lavinia is. She's the princess of the natives, of the locals. And Aeneas basically has to win her, has to marry her. Her father wants it, but there's complications, so war breaks out. And that love story is actually the core of this story, even though it's a war story kind of on the outside. So in the first half, we had an Odyssey with an Iliad inside. Now we have an Iliad with an Odyssey inside. Or if you like, we had a love donut concealing a core of war jelly the first time. Now we have a war donut concealing a core of love jelly. So I think that Virgil knows that he's doing it on purpose, and that it's part of the game he's playing, part of the complexity he's showing, and part of the reality he's portraying, which is that even great endeavors like the founding of Rome contain a lot of grief. There is a lot of ruin in a nation, as Adam Smith once said. And so there's stuff you have to leave behind in the first half. There's pain, there's suffering, even though there is also love. And here, even though there's greatness and excellence, there is also going to be war. And that's what this invocation tells us. Erato is very much there on purpose. She's extremely important because the fact that he says, Erato, tell me all about war, is kind of the key to understanding this whole section. And here's how I know, besides the fact that I just think that structure itself is really clear and powerful throughout the poem. I also know this because Virgil is very clearly, and nobody disagrees about this, Virgil is very clearly referring back to another invocation of Erato from one of his heroes, one of his great literary role models, Apollonius of Rhodes. We've talked about him before. He's a poet from the Hellenistic era, a Greek poet from after the classical period of Athens, who composed in Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria, and in Rhodes, which is why he's called Apollonius of Rhodes. And his most famous work is the only epic that survives for us from the Hellenistic era. It's called the Argonautica, and it's the story of Jason and the Argonauts. Maybe you know it from reading the myths as a kid or something. Jason has to go and get the golden fleece, right? And that's the story that Apollonius tells. But like Virgil, he is a very coy, sly, tricksy poet who does a lot of unexpected things. And that's one way that Virgil, I think, admires him and tends to refer back to him. He was a big influence on many poets of this era, including Ovid, for instance, who also loved the Hellenistic poets. The Augustan poets really look to the Hellenistic poets as role models. And here, it's very, very clear that Virgil has Apollonius in mind, because that opening that I read in Latin, nunc age, Erato, now come, go, age is like act or do, now rouse up, Erato, is exactly the same as what Apollonius says at the beginning of Argonautica, Book 3. Ed age. It's even the same word in Greek, really, as it is in Latin. Come now, Erato, eid agenun Erato in the hexameters of the Greek. And what's really important here is that this is also the middle point of the Argonautica. Just like we are at the middle point of Virgil's Aeneid, we are also at the middle point of Apollonius' Argonautica. We are at a transition of themes, and most importantly, given what we've been talking about and giving the debate over like what's Erato doing here, most importantly of all, Erato is being invoked to tell a story of love that is going to go horribly, catastrophically wrong. And that's not quite what Virgil is doing, but it's like Erato, the muse of love, now come to tell a story that will involve a whole bunch of war and bloodshed. Because the story that Apollonius is about to tell is the story of Jason and Medea. If you know anything about the story of Jason and Medea, you know that it does not turn out great. They are lovers, and Jason takes Medea away from her homeland after she helps him to get the Golden Fleece. But after that, he abandons her and she kills his children. At least that's how it goes in the most famous version of the story, Euripides' Medea. And in the Argonautica, Medea is going to be ruined by this love, burned alive with passion, just like Dido was. She was a big model. The last time we talked about Apollonius was when we were talking about Dido and the love that kind of pierces Dido's heart. And Medea in the Argonautica was a huge model and paradigm and example for that moment as well. So we know that Apollonius was on Virgil's mind. We know that he's referring specifically back here to this moment at the midpoint of a poem. And we know that this Erato invocation is much less lovey-dovey than it seems, or at least it's not just about love, or it's about the destructive powers of love as well as it's about love. I've translated this section from the Argonautica for you as well, so I just want to read it so you can get a flavor for what's going on. When I translate Greek, unlike the Latin hexameters of Virgil, when I translate Greek, I do it in this kind of loping, dactylic, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da kind of rhythm. It's a little bit more loose because I think that the Greek verses have a little bit looser feel. So this is going to sound slightly different from Virgil. Here we go. Eid agenun Erato. Come on now, Erato, stand by me and speak to me. Tell me what's next. How Jason made off with the fleece and carried it back to Iolcus, along with Medea's love. You share a domain with Cypris, a destiny, using your charms of love to enchant unmarried girls, and to you as well is attached the title of love. Now, there are a number of themes here, besides just the love-war thing, that Virgil is clearly thinking about and picking up on. For one thing, we get to the end of this section, we get all these words about witchcraft, which is not a good sign, right? Medea herself is a witch, and now Erato turns out to be a witch. She Thelgane. She is, he says Thelgase, which means you enchant or you ensorcel with your love charms and the pains of love. And you're doing it to these unmarried girls, right, who are defenseless, and then they get pierced, and to you as well as attached to the title of love. It's also a kind of fate, because the domain that she shares with Cypris, who is Aphrodite, is immores. It's like destined. There is a kind of like immutable destiny going on here, a fate that Erato can't shake, and that the people she infects also can't shake. And of course, destiny is one of the great themes of the Aeneid as well, right? Aeneas can't choose to stay with Dido because he has to go and found Rome. Lavinia, in the end, it turns out, really like is destined to be the new bride of Aeneas in the same way that Dido is destined to not be the new bride. So there's real like kind of parallelism or inversal going on here, right? That we had Dido who was destined not to be Aeneas' bride, and now we're going to have Lavinia who is destined to be Aeneas' bride. There's actually a prophecy about it. And we have this recollection of Medea and Jason. And that love affair really did go terribly wrong. This love affair, as I'll get into in a second, is about to cause a whole bunch of problems. But what's Virgil really up to in the end here, right? What are we doing? I think, and this is just me talking to you here, but I think that Virgil is now very purposefully going to set right everything that was wrong about the first half of the poem. Everything that was falling apart in the Odyssey section. The fact that Aeneas was so lost and didn't know who he was and where to go, the fact that Troy had fallen, the fact that he had to abandon a woman, he was destined to deny himself love and deny a woman love through fate, right, is now going to be flipped and inversed like a photo negative in this second half. And as they say in, I think it's the Lord of the Rings, right? Sam says, is everything bad going to come untrue? Not everything bad is going to come untrue. There are still going to be costs to pay in this section. But I really think that Virgil is kind of giving us like the solution. He's untying the knot that exists in a lot of this Greek poetry. And remember that he is trying to do something greater. He said just now, a greater work begins, right? A greater order of things is setting into motion. And he means it. He means that this is going to be better than anything that has come before. It's going to still have all the difficulties that were involved, but I'm going to basically untie these threads and set things in order. The ordo of things, the ordo rerum, is going to be the theme of this poem. And so in that way, it is kind of an inverse of all of the dark, bitter, and kind of poisoned parts of the first half of the poem. That is my take on where we're going here, right? What is about to happen, what we're about to launch into. But you should know, and this is part of the fun of things, that there's lots of other interpretations of this Erato section, just like there are lots of other interpretations of the big question, is this a good or bad poem, a happy or a sad poem? My view is just that Virgil really knows what he's about. Yes, there are some unfinished parts, but the whole composition is very carefully, clearly, intentionally structured. And in the end, we're going to get to the very last scene, which is dark and grim. In the end, the darkness and the grimness of the end is not actually the ultimate statement on Rome, that this is a good, in the end, this is a good thing. This is a story of love for destiny, love for Lavinia, for a woman, and love for Rome, love for the greatness that is about to come. But there's a whole lot of war in the middle. And that, by the way, that kind of irony and complexity that I've been talking about in Virgil is also there in Shakespeare. The Shakespeare monologue that I read to you at the beginning, the Richard III, if we go back and look at it, right? Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the son of York. Well, it's true. The war is over, and there's going to now be a time ostensibly of peace. But the person who's saying it is Richard III, this crippled, bitter, angry man who is, as he says, determined to be a villain. So the whole thing is thick with bitter irony. And that invocation of love, the transition to love, is kind of secretly a transition to personal, private war. And here, I think, the transition to what looks like a war poem, to Iliad, is actually saturated with greatness and with love and with excitement. Okay. We're on our way now. We are embarking on the second half of the poem. I'm going to do things a little bit differently here than I otherwise have been doing in the past. In the first half of the poem, I basically took you through chronologically, book by book. And that was the best way to do it because it really was about the plot and about the story. And we wanted to keep the events straight in our mind as we went and so on and so forth. This second section, fittingly, because it's modeled after a different poem, is slightly different. The plot is relatively straightforward. The main beats of the plot are relatively straightforward. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell you what happens in the rest of the poem. So you're ready and you know what to expect it. And then I'm going to go back over a series of episodes and talk about the major themes and the major passages. So we'll probably have about 6 episodes on this next section, but they won't necessarily be like book 7, book 8, book 9, book 10. I'm just going to tell you the plot right now, and then from there we will kind of go and thread through it and talk about all the different things that Virgil does. So what happens? They land in Italy, in this place where they're supposed to be, and they've been traveling, remember, up the coast of Italy. They have made it as far as Cumae to consult the Sibyl, and then they kind of bounce their way up and they get to Hesperia. And this is a word that means the West. West of what, you may ask? Well, west at least of Greece, right? Greece is to the east of Italy, and the Greeks have colonies here, but also they know of people who are not Greek, which is a very remarkable thing to the Greeks, right? The Greeks kind of divide the world into Greek and non-Greek, and the non-Greeks in Italy are called the Tyrrhenians. And that is why Virgil says to Erato, tell me about all the might of Tyrrhenia, all the Tyrrhenian might mustered up. This is basically the Etruscans. And the whole story that we're about to get between the confrontation, the encounter between Aeneas, the Trojan, and these local indigenous natives, these people of Tyrrhenia, these people of Tyrrhenitude, this whole thing is basically standing in for, or an analog for, Rome's relationship to its Latin neighbors. There were many other peoples in the vicinity of Rome when it started out, and there were many, many growing pains as Rome started to dominate Italy, including wars, including things like, it's called the Social War, because Rome had these allies, socii, in its vicinity that then rebelled, and they had to put them down. And the question, like, are we allies, are we brothers, or are we foes, are we enemies? That was very live in Rome's early history, and we're about to get that now kind of in mythic form as Aeneas arrives to meet with these locals in the place that will become Rome. So the ruler of the place where he lands is called King Latinus, and that's where we're told the Latins come from, right? And the Latin language and so forth. The area is Latium. And so when you hear Latium, that's just the place that Latinus rules over. Eventually, the city that Aeneas founds is going to be called Lavinium, after Lavinia, and that will be followed by Alba Longa and then Rome. And that's outside the scope of the poem, but just so you know kind of how this all connects to reality and history, right? Like I said, the place is going to be called Lavinium because Aeneas is going ultimately to marry Lavinia, daughter of King Latinus. There is a prophecy that Lavinia has to marry a foreigner. She can't marry a local. And that would be the most obvious thing for her to do. There are many people, just as there were people waiting to know who was going to succeed Augustus, there are many people waiting to know who's going to succeed Latinus. And the obvious thing would be to make an alliance with the locals and the natives, but there's a prophecy that she can't do that. And so when Aeneas arrives, Latinus immediately recognizes him as the great foretold guy, the dude for his daughter. So he's all in. He's ready to make an alliance here, and this looks like smooth sailing until, guess who? We might have forgotten about Juno, the goddess Juno. There is still a goddess that hates Aeneas and doesn't want this to happen and is really pissed off now because of the whole Dido thing and Carthage, and like it's been a long journey. So she is going to descend to meddle yet again, or rather she's not going to descend in person, but rather she's going to send Alecto, the Fury, and that's a great section which we will definitely talk about probably next time. She sends Alecto the Fury to seed discord and to aggravate underlying tensions, which are many, which are rife, right? Because now this newcomer is going to come and scoop up the daughter of the king. There's somebody who has fair cause to be pretty annoyed about that, and that is Turnus. Turnus of the Rutulians. And Alecto, the Fury, who often kind of provokes female rage, right? She provokes Amata to demand marriage with Lavinia. They're not going to go quietly. Turnus must marry Lavinia. They won't back down about this. And so war breaks out and the Iliad ensues, right? That's what Virgil's talking about when he says, sing now, muse, this theme of war. The Iliad ensues. Turnus basically is Hector, the enemy that Aeneas has to face. There is a Patroclus stand-in, which is to say the companion of Achilles who died in order to bring Achilles into the war. That's Pallas in this version of the story. And Pallas likewise dies, sending Aeneas into a rage. Aeneas kills Turnus. End of poem. And we're going to get into end of poem in great detail when we get to it. But that's the story. That's what's about to happen. And we will revisit elements of that section, but I just wanted you to have the outline in advance, and you can come back to this episode and refer to it if you like, so that then when we talk about all the different themes and the motifs and the shield and the stuff that is coming, you will know what's going on. This portion of the poem, I'm going to warn you outright, used to be by far my less favorite of the two. I love the first section of the Aeneid. And in school, when I read the second section, I was like, this is sort of like a lot of lists and fighting, and there's like a catalog, which is always kind of takes the air out of the room. Now, I have to say, I like it more and more the more I think about it. And you know who else loved this section of the poem, and this really ought to whet your appetite, is C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis loved the Aeneid, I've mentioned this before, I think. He loved the Aeneid. And he wrote about it, translated portions of it throughout his life. And there's a lot about the Aeneid in Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost, which, if you haven't read it, is one of the great treatments of epic poetry in English, bar none. It's so, so good. And there's a lot about the Aeneid in it, because for Lewis, the Aeneid is an example of a particular kind of epic. He has this whole scheme and theory about primary epic and secondary epic, the epic that used to be sung in actual occasions and the epic that was sort of written down. And this is a secondary version, a written down epic. And so he talks about this a lot. And he says that this moment when Aeneas arrives on shore is the moment when we feel most powerfully what secondary epic can do. This kind of epic that comes late in a tradition, that looks back to, in this case, Homer, right, and looks back to the times when men really did sing in great halls spontaneously and make up poetry on the fly. Now we're writing down things. Now there's a kind of ancientness baked in, even to the distant theme of the past. And here's what Lewis says. He says, "There is a poetry that reiterated readings cannot exhaust in all these early Italian scenes, in the first sight of the Tiber, the lonely prayer to that unknown river, and the long river journey on which the ships startle those hitherto unviolated forests. I do not know a better example of imagination in the highest sense than when Charon," that's the ferryman in the underworld, remember, when Charon wonders at the golden bow so long unseen, dark centuries of that unhistoried lower world are conjured up in half a line. Beautiful, as always, when Lewis writes like this. But this idea that we're writing about the distant mists of legend here with the arrival of Aeneas, but that even in that distant antiquity, there is a deeper antiquity. There's a deeper past that is kind of lost. And that feeling of arrival now for something new on the top of something very, very old is kind of, for Lewis, the quintessential feeling of the poem. So I'm really looking forward to getting to know this second section even better with you. Hopefully you have a sense of kind of what we're in for now and of how good a poet Virgil is. Have I mentioned that he's really, really good at poetry? There is just something so marvelous about uncovering layer after layer of what he has to say. And I think this invocation to Erato and this introduction of the new great theme of war through the lens of love is really amazing. Okay, so that's it for the poem for now. It's time for It Figures. This is the section where I think the music just changed a little bit. Usually do, but now it's do. Anyway, this is the section where I tell you about figures of speech and types of technique that poets use. Mostly I've been talking about these technical terms for ways of using particular words. And I'm going to keep doing that because there's lots of those and the words themselves are great. But there's an obvious choice again this time around for what to talk about, and that is irony. Irony is a word that comes from Greek, aeronia. And it's a word in English that has become such a buzzword. It was so trendy for a while in the early 2000s. I feel like irony was the name of the game. It was the defining feature of our culture, and 1,000 think pieces bloomed about how this is the age of irony and millennials love irony in their art, etc. And like any word that becomes a catchphrase for a moment, it kind of lost all of its meaning and everything was said to be ironic and nobody quite knew what irony was. And that's a shame because irony is one of the hardest things to define to begin with, and it's one of the most powerful artistic tools. So the best way in, I think, is to talk about the Greek word aironia, which means pretext, dissembling, hypocrisy, right? It's like when you put up a screen and there's something in front, but there's also something behind. And so I would say that the best way to think about irony in literature and just in general is when you can see through the screen, either on purpose or not on purpose. Sometimes there's purposeful irony. One version of that is famously dramatic irony, when on stage we know something that the characters don't, but we're supposed to know it, right? Because the author has put up this screen that we can see through. That's one version of irony. Another is when the screen was not supposed to be see-through. And wow, that's ironic, right? You kind of get a little glimpse into something behind that screen. But that's where all of this sense that we have in irony of double meaning, of kind of detachment, right? There are all these different things that we can use irony to mean. We say that a work of art is ironic if it's kind of hipster, like it takes something that was beloved in the past and wears it ironically, like, oh, I'm wearing this mustache ironically, or I'm referring back to Pokemon ironically, right? But we also use irony when it's not funny at all, when it's like, oh, it's a terrible irony that Oedipus is searching for the murderer and it's him all along, right? All of these concepts are kind of united by this concept of the screen that you can see through. Often in school, you'll get the definition unexpected effect or kind of reversal, right? A reverse of what's being said. You say something, but you mean the opposite. And again, that is one version of irony, but it's not the only version. When you say like, oh yeah, sarcasm is a kind of irony, right? Oh yeah, that is awesome that we get another 4 years of Trump, right? If somebody says that, they mean like, it's not awesome, right? But that's only one example, again, of this aeronia, the pretext, the thing hiding behind the screen. So I think that the monologue I read to you from Richard III, excuse me, right? The monologue at the beginning that I read about war is a classic example of irony, right? Laced with irony. Oh, isn't it so great that war is over and now it's time for peace? Say I, Richard III, who am determined to be a villain, right? Who am going to do all sorts of nasty stuff over the next several hours, right? And I think that the invocation to Erato is also a classic example of irony when there is like this. But again, it's not funny particularly, right? We think of irony sometimes as funny or as like snide, but it's not funny or snide. It's like there is this screen in front, Erato, and then very, very visibly behind that, in fact, explicitly behind that, there's all of this war, right? And so that effect makes us feel things. And one thing it makes us do is ask questions like, what's going on here? It creates a sense of sort of like double vision. It also makes you like ask more questions about the poetry. There's a lot of different uses that irony can be put to, but I would say its kind of core function is to create like a sort of tart flavor. Like it's like when you mix two things together that you wouldn't expect to go together in food, and you get that umami sense with that kind of raspberry tang. I wouldn't think that would work, but actually, like it creates this secret third thing. Like irony has that power, and I think Virgil is a master of irony in this invocation to the muse Erato, even though he's by no means ironic in the way that we usually use it, which is as a contrast to sincere, right? Usually when we say ironic, we mean not sincere. I think Virgil's perfectly sincere, but also he's ironic. So next time you hear that word, you will sort of know what it's supposed to mean, even though it now means like everything and a half. That's It Figures. I guess we have a new theme song now for It Figures, apparently. And one last thing before I go, and that is the mailbag. I have a mailbag question that I'm very excited and eager to answer. These questions come to me through Substack, which is really the place to be. You got to go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com and become a subscriber. You can pay to support me if you like, or you can just be a free subscriber. And either way, you can write me a direct message and ask questions that you're having, doubts, concerns, curiosity, things you want to know about. Today I have one from Elizabeth, and I think that Elizabeth is probably not alone in her question. She says, "Hi, Spencer. I tried reading the Odyssey and found myself completely unable to follow along and keep with it. Is there a resource in the style of your sister's podcast with notes along the way? Maybe an audio version? Thanks!" Exclamation point. I feel very stupid trying to read this on my own. Lol. Okay, don't feel stupid. The first thing I hope to do is alleviate that sense. And that's why I'm taking this question today. Because remember when I talked about how people have been asking questions over Virgil's invocation of the muse forever, right? There are plenty of places in classic literature where even the best, most sensitive readers will get to it and go, I don't know. Like, in fact, that's sometimes the wisest thing to do is to say, I don't know. I don't understand this. Now, Elizabeth is having another problem, which is that there's stuff she feels she's supposed to be understanding, but she's not understanding it. And she's basically asking, like, can we get Faith Moore to explain it to us? If you don't know about my sister's podcast, my sister Faith Moore has a podcast called Storytime for Grown-Ups. And it's a little bit different from this one in that she does talk about the books that she reads, but mostly she just reads the books and then she annotates them as she goes. And if you're not following it, you totally should be. It's so good. She's about to do Frankenstein, the great novel, I would call it a horror novel, although it's less horrific than you might expect. It's more sophisticated and reflective and scientific and philosophical. And she's going to be reading it aloud for the Halloween season. So definitely go subscribe to that. Sadly, she does not have a season yet, I guess, about the Odyssey. So I can't really recommend that to you, Elizabeth, but I have a few tips, a few suggestions, some of which I asked my sister about. I said, like, what would you recommend to this person? So this is the combined might of the Clavin siblings, Spencer and Faith. My first suggestion is, rather than an annotated version, you might want to try an adapted version. And this is another thing that people feel very embarrassed about, like abridgments and adaptations and whatever. But hopefully by now you've seen that adaptations are very much traditional. They're very much part of the history of literature. They can be phenomenal in their own right. And the Odyssey is a classic example of a story that has been adapted a million times. I've talked about this before. It's Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, right? I don't think that those are really going to help you here, but there are some kind of just story-forward versions of the Odyssey, if you like. They're kind of like retellings of it that might give you the lay of the land and kind of get you into the story, so that then when you go back to the poem itself, you can like connect to it and you kind of know what's going on in advance. Just like how I just said what happens in the second part of the Aeneid, right? When we then talk about little sections, you'll recognize like, oh, like that's that part. So a few different ones. There's a book called Odyssey by Stephen Fry, the wonderful comedian who unfortunately sometimes gets annoying and preachy and political, but he's a very, very funny comedian and a pretty good student of the ancient world. So he has a lot of stuff that he's written retelling the Greek myths, and he has a book called Odyssey that you might want to check out. There's a graphic novel by Gareth Hines that might be good to read and look at. And then the one that I really think actually might be a huge help to start with before you try to dig into the Odyssey itself is Epic the Musical. I've talked about this before on the show, but I keep getting questions like, what do you think about Epic? So I want to just reiterate that I think Epic the Musical might be the best adaptation of Homer that has been produced in my lifetime. It's not a fully staged musical. It's something that this guy, Jorge Rivera Herons, I think is his name, made it like in his apartment, basically. And it's him and a bunch of friends singing basically this imagined musical, but it's the whole story of the Odyssey. And he does change some things like most adaptations do. But he tells the major story outline, and he gives you basically all the characters, and he does it with these awesome musical theater, kind of like rock opera style numbers that are really catchy. And I don't know if you like to listen to musicals. I do. I love musical scores, and this is one that I listen to a lot. There will be differences with the main plot, but that could be kind of fun in itself to sort of start to notice the differences. And the major themes, right? The homecoming, the journey, et cetera, are laid out. And this is the next important thing, right? The story goes in chronological order. So the other thing about the Odyssey specifically that might be giving you trouble is that the part of it people know and love most is really like a few books. It's like books 9 to 11 or 12 or so. And that's the part where Odysseus tells his story of the journey and the Cyclops and the sirens and the monsters and the magic and all of that, Circe, Calypso, yada, yada. Although Calypso is, I guess, outside of that story. But most of the stuff is in that little story within a story that Homer gives us. And you are allowed to just read that section to start with. You're allowed to skip to the good part and start from there. Because the rest of it is like also really good and really cool, but it might not be kind of what you're looking for. And you want to start with the place where you have the most footholds. That's why I'm saying, like, look at an adaptation, listen to Epic, right? Because then you will have acquaintance with, familiarity with the major plot points. And there might be moments where you're kind of swimming along and then it's like, oh, the sirens, right? I know who they are. And then you can like latch on. And this, again, there is no shame in this. Like basically everybody does this. Like when I read the Odyssey for the first time, I knew the story in advance. The Greeks knew the story in advance, right? That's part of ancient literature is most people knew the beats of the story. And that's how you can connect to it. And that leads to the final and most important suggestion, piece of advice, which Faith gave to me. It's entirely Faith's suggestion. let it wash over you. You don't have to understand everything. You don't even have to understand the things that you're technically supposed to understand, right? You might be going for a while through and feeling like, I don't know, like there's some questions that I have and I'm not totally sure that I get this. Just press through and like enjoy the parts that you can enjoy. And the reason for that is, and again, another great faith point is like, when we read modern books that we read for pleasure, we think, like, oh, I'm not supposed to understand everything. I'm enjoying the ride. I'm enjoying finding things out. I have questions. When we read ancient books, suddenly all of that flies out the window and we think, I have to understand everything or I'm being dumb, right? But you don't. You don't have to understand everything. You can embark on this journey with like, I know kind of the outlines of the plot. I know the themes. Maybe I'm going to start with the core section that I'm most familiar with. And then if there's parts that I don't get, like that's part of it. And then maybe you are going along and you hit a catch and you're like, oh, that's Circe. Like I know Circe. And then suddenly you're in it for a while. And maybe now you understand like 5 to 10%. And that builds and builds and builds. And especially if you are into rereading, right, it'll build again when you go back, right, after you've done one pass through. Let yourself off the hook from understanding everything initially. And this is my piece of advice that I always give is just see if you might want to read with friends. You can try kind of getting together with a group and saying, we're going to just read book 9 today and read it aloud together and see like what each of you understands and don't understand. That's another kind of hot tip. But mostly I think like you're allowed to just read selections. You're allowed to not understand everything. You're allowed to start with an adaptation. And you're not dumb. This is like part of the process. So I hope that helps. I really am grateful for the opportunity to answer that question because it's something that I know a lot of people struggle with. And the point of this show is to like give you guys a way into this stuff because it really is. The rewards of it are enormous. It will set you free from being trapped in your own time period. It will be a thing of beauty and a joy forever to you to have a reading life that broadens your horizons. And eventually, it doesn't always have to be this hard, right? If you do press through and you take this advice that Faith and I are giving you and you work on it, it won't always be this hard. Eventually, it'll be something you want to do, something you like and enjoy. And then it will be, like all acquired tastes, richer and deeper than the stuff that you just happen to enjoy automatically on your own. Okay, thanks for that question. One more time, it's rejoiceevermore.substack.com to ask me questions. And don't forget to share this podcast if you have liked what we talk about. And if you want to know more, hit subscribe so that you never miss an episode. We are getting in on, I think we've got probably about 5 episodes left on this Aeneid series. And then we will embark on a new adventure together. I would love for you to come along for that. Rate, review, share, subscribe, let people know about it. Check out my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World. And I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.